Welcome everybody to our final webinar for this first season, or maybe it's our second season of the FIJ series, Inside the Investigation. I'm Ellen Weiss, and I'm honored to be a board member of FIJ. We started this series for a couple of reasons. We get a chance to shine a light on some terrific and really impactful investigations. The work, and then we get to hear directly from the reporters and producers about how they did these groundbreaking investigations. We get to share concrete tips and resources that all of you and other journalists and journalism outlets can use in your own work. We obviously get to feature investigations that were produced with the fund's support, and we'll talk more about how you can apply for FIJ grants and how we can help you, and we'll do that at the end of the webinar. Just a little bit of housekeeping. I'm going to talk with our two guests for about 20 or 30 minutes. If you have questions, you can add them at any time that they occur to you in the Q&A section. And also, we are recording this webinar, and we will be posting it and sharing it with all of you, and a tip sheet on the FIJ website, but we'll actually be emailing it to you, so you don't have to take notes. You're safe, and you can just sit back and enjoy yourselves. So today I am super excited because we're hearing from the two of the very talented members of the team behind the 13th Step, which is a podcast from the document team at New Hampshire Public Radio. This series is the result of a multi-year investigation into a culture of sexual misconduct within American substance use disorder treatment and recovery communities. Like many investigations that we've featured here and that probably many of you have worked on, this began with a single story, but it quickly transformed into something far larger, far more complex, far weirder. Unlike most stories, this investigation didn't end with its initial publication, because after the team published their first report online and on the air, over a year before the actual podcast was released, an entirely new chapter unfolded. Laura Chooljian, the lead reporter, soon found that exposing alleged abuses had left her family, her news organization, vulnerable in unexpected and very serious ways. Personally, I have to say that this was really one of my favorite podcasts. Yes, I listened twice. And I am really blown away by the fact that New Hampshire Public Radio launched this long-form narrative podcast unit, the document team, and remains so committed to this kind of reporting and storytelling. Not to mention that this team is really tiny. I think it was ultimately about 5 people who put this reporting together. I'm not the only one who's impressed with the work. The 13th Step has won so many awards. DuPont Columbia, it was a Pulitzer Prize finalist, an Ambie for Best Reporting. Lauren was honored with the Courage in Journalism Award by the International Women's Media Foundation, and also honored with a First Amendment Award from the RTNDA, and I'm sure I left out a couple of awards. So we're going to get into the challenges covering this topic, from how do you validate allegations, getting sources to go on the record, lawsuits, vandalism, and about, oversight of this industry. Our two guests, Laura Chooljian is a senior reporter and producer for New Hampshire Public Radio's document team. Before joining NHPR in 2017, Lauren spent nearly 6 years as a reporter and producer and a fill-in host at WBEZ, which is the public radio station in Chicago. And she is a proud graduate, and they are very proud of her from the Medill School of Journalism at Northwestern University. Katie Culinary is NHPR's senior editor of podcasts. She is leading the newsroom's narrative podcast unit, the document team. Before joining NHPR, Katie spent almost 9 years at WHYY, which is the public radio station in Philadelphia. She helped lead the newsroom there. She was assistant news director, and I'm so delighted to have you both here, so thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah. let's go to that like beginning, right? It's early in the pandemic, it's 2020. Lauren, you're reporting on an outbreak of COVID-19 at something called the Granite Recovery Center, which was the largest addiction treatment network in New Hampshire. And not long after the story's published, you get a tip about the founder of the network. And the founder's name is Eric Spofford.
Hmm.
And there are allegations that he has sexually abused female clients and employees. And you start making calls. So tell us a little bit about what you learned.
Yeah, it's not an email you get every day. The exact tip was that this person was glad that I had been looking into Granite Recovery Centers and Eric Spofford because, as they said, this guy has been paying off women for years and described, as you said, these allegations of sexual harassment and sexual misconduct. I mean, I was like stunned, to be honest, to get this email. It's like, you don't believe every email you get, but that certainly is the type of thing that sets you on a course. And so I responded to this woman who had been an employee of their biggest provider, which was Green Mountain Treatment Center, which is up in northern New Hampshire. And I just started making calls like you always do. And I think the moment when I realized that this was quite something was when people who didn't know each other or didn't know that I was calling had similar stories. It was like details were checking out before I was even in the phase of reporting where you're like, okay, this is what I've got. And how am I going to try and nail down all of these details or corroborate all this stuff? I had heard from two separate women similar behaviors that they said Eric had exhibited to them. And I just thought, huh, okay, well, that's interesting. What I would end up finding out, of course, if you've listened to the show, is that Eric Spofford, who was the CEO and founder of this provider, that he had been sexually assaulting or sexually harassing women for years, and that it was an open secret in the recovery community in New England, not just New Hampshire, because it's very small around here. And if you're going to some places, you're running into people who are going to others. And so Eric really had built for himself a really powerful network to the point where this guy was like friends with the governor. He was a local guy who had an answer to a seemingly unsolvable problem that we had. I mean, anyone on this call likely knows that New Hampshire was one of the states that was really hard hit in the early days of the opioid crisis. And it just felt like, what are we going to do? And here comes this guy who's extremely charismatic, a local guy who's willing to put his whole life towards not just his own recovery, but helping others find recovery and then building this great business. I mean, it really felt to, I think, the people in power in New Hampshire, like, oh, good, like finally someone's going to solve this thing for us. But unfortunately, what was happening underground among people who unfortunately are not always listened to, that actually, like Eric was not treating people well and in fact affecting their path to recovery.
Yeah, I was going to say Eric Spofford has a really compelling personal story, right? And
Sure.
a vision and a mission around recovery. I mean, you started a little bit, but and Katie, jump in at any point. Tell us a little bit about his reputation in New Hampshire, like what you knew about him before you started this reporting, and why, like I don't know if why this seems surprising, or like what you were taking on.
Yeah, so before we broke that story just about the COVID outbreak, the tips that we had gotten were from basically nurses who worked at Green Mountain Treatment Center who said, and this was like stories we were all doing at the time, like not to take everyone back to that part, but like, we were all doing these outbreak stories and finding out places that maybe weren't taking COVID seriously and weren't taking the proper precautions. And we'd gotten two separate tips from women who were like, hey, like we don't even have PPE here. We take people from all around the country, like something's not right. And honestly, it wasn't until I got those tips that I had ever heard the name Eric Spofford. Like he wasn't big on my radar at that point. And I remember looking him up, and the first couple things that would come up were these YouTube videos where Eric would have someone film him or he'd film himself going out to the streets where you could purchase heroin and talking to people and trying to like take them along and say like, tell me about your using and here's how I can help you. And let me take you to McDonald's and I'll buy you. I was like, who is this guy? Like, I just was really like, what is this? And the more I dug, the more I found that over the years he had established from a sober home to now this like big provider. He had really become someone, like I said, that the governor, especially Kristen Sununu, our current governor, would really lean on. I mean, Governor Sununu even had done a press conference at a Granite Recovery Center's facility saying that Eric is the guy to call when he has questions about the opioid epidemic. Since things have changed since all this reporting is coming out, but that was really like here's a guy with a story that I think a lot of politicians in New Hampshire wanted to believe in, someone who's local, someone who devoted his life to service. And here he is making a huge impact in a place where we're really struggling to find a way to heal people.
Katie, I wonder, like when Lauren came to you and she was like, yikes, I got these tips. Had you faced something like this before where sort of a high profile person was facing, was dealing with those allegations? Like what was, how did you respond? How did you deal with it?
Yeah, so actually this is something that Lauren could probably, I think at least for the first chunk of the questions, Lauren could probably respond much better than I could because actually I joined the team in 2022, about a month before they were
Yeah,
getting
poor
ready to
Katie.
put out the
Poor
first
Katie started and we were like, so.
Okay, fair
So
enough.
that,
Yeah.
and so that does come to play, a little bit later when we kind of get to like, the big turning point with this investigation. So I started right at the time that Lauren and our boss, Dan Barrick, the news director, our colleague Jason Moon on the document team. Also want to shout out Allison McAdam, who was the lead editor of the project. She, really was instrumental. And actually, I think Lauren, I want to say that was kind of this was the type of thing that sort of led to them bringing on Allison, right? And
Yes.
really to hiring a permanent role like mine to help shepherd these kinds of things. So I'll
Yeah.
stop here, but then Lauren, we'll fill in all those blanks later. Yeah.
Yeah, so since this is like a journalism audience, you'll all be interested to know that at the time that like Jason and I had initially got those tips and were starting to dig into the COVID outbreak, which then led to this, we were also finding a path to doing, documentary style audio reporting full time. So this was all kind of happening at once. And at the time, our news director was in charge of me and Jason, which was a wild thing for him to have to do. Bless Dan Barrick's heart, is he's got the newsroom and the daily clock, and then he's got us like being like, well, so we got this crazy situation. And so at the time, as I started to compile multiple allegations, I talked to people, if you listen to the show, like Employee A and Elizabeth, I started to feel like, wow, we really got something on our hands here. And also because I was starting to hear from sources who were deciding to go on the record or weren't ever going to be on the record that Eric Spofford was a dangerous guy who was really wealthy, who would never sit out a legal battle, and that I should be careful. And, you
Mm.
hear things from people and, you're like, thank you for saying that. And I didn't really, I didn't really pay much mind, to be honest. I was like, all right, thank you for that, whatever, move on. And, then you start to hear it more often. And it wasn't that we like needed extra editorial support because we thought this was a dangerous story. It was more that we realized like we're really sitting on a big investigation here. And we think that there could be a podcast eventually, since that's like what our jobs at that point had been intended for. But we also were like, we actually have some local stuff that really needs to get out, probably faster than a podcast could be produced. And
Yeah.
so we brought in, and we're really lucky that we had the funding that we could bring Allison McAdam in, who is an excellent editor, and I would highly recommend her for anything. She worked on Believed, which was one of my favorite member station podcasts and still is to this day, about Larry Nassar. And so she had that, experience of sexual misconduct. But, as we all know, with the Larry Nassar case, there was a lot of documentation that was ignored by authorities in, gymnastics or at Michigan State. So there was paperwork. Whereas with this story, no one had filed a police report. No one was like felt confident in being able to come forward because Eric was such a wealthy, powerful guy. A lot of these people, use substances. So the police are like not who you'd go to.
Yeah.
And so it was the kind of thing where it was really intense. I mean, dare I say shoe leather reporting where it
Well,
was really,
I want to ask you about that. You get this tip, you start trying to figure out like what actually is happening behind closed doors. You spend 15 months working on that story. And so maybe you could just talk a little bit about finding the sources. And then, as you said, like, how do you verify those sources?
yeah.
How do you know what they're saying is true? Because there isn't a paper trail necessarily.
Correct. So Elizabeth is an example that I'll give. So Elizabeth was a woman I spoke to early-ish on in this investigation, and she had been given free treatment by Eric. They had a friend in common. Elizabeth had relapsed. She like had used heroin for years and was sober when she got in an accident and was prescribed all these pain medications. And then that just was really difficult to come back from. So this friend in common hooks her up with Eric Spofford. Eric says, I'll pay for you to get treatment, which can I say, like, I think the stat is only 1 in 10 people who need addiction treatment will get it. And so this is already starting a power dynamic, right? Like Elizabeth is in desperate need of medical help, and it's hard to get into places or to even know where to start. And it's really impossible as anyone with a person in their family or in their circle with addiction, like getting someone even through that door just for that one person is really difficult. So Elizabeth gets there and it's free. She's starting to heal. She really will tell you that she loved her experience at Green Mountain Treatment Centers. And then Eric's staff assign her to a sober home once she's done with 30 days. And she gets her phone back, and there's like a Snapchat from Eric Spofford, and it's like a picture of his penis and like explicit like requests to have sex, which is like, what? And, Elizabeth does a beautiful job of explaining the vulnerability of not just when you're in active addiction, but in early recovery, when you're trying to get your feet under you. And as one woman told us that works in recovery, like, you don't even know what your favorite color is. And now here's a person giving you this attention. You're like really stunned by it. Elizabeth never met up with Eric. She never asked for anything like this. But it was a really, really, unfortunately, emotional time for her. And, relapses happen in recovery, but she ended up relapsing and didn't feel like she could go to anybody because Eric is the guy who gave her treatment. Eric's the guy whose staff put her in the sober home. Who are they going to believe? It's on Snapchat. It disappeared. So as a reporter, Snapchat, that's a difficult one, right? Because as we all know, it's gone the minute she looks at it. She can't take a screenshot or Eric would be alerted. And so the first thing I asked her was, did you tell anybody? And weirdly, the person she told actually came to me through other means. And so I was already talking to this guy recommended by somebody else because, it's a small world around here. And if someone says, I think, I know of a situation where Eric Spofford like sent a dick pic to my friend, like that started to get around to people who were talking to me. So I had Justin Downey coming to me in one direction, and then I had Elizabeth in the other. And then Elizabeth tells me, well, the only person I told as close to when it happened is this friend of mine, and I'll ask him for permission. And it was like just this, that's when you're like, okay, this is wild. And so that was one way I corroborated it. And that's the thing I always say about this kind of reporting is, oftentimes people don't tell people. There's only two people in the room, or there's two people in the interaction. And so that makes it really difficult. But I asked Elizabeth also to help me corroborate anything around the time, any evidence that you were where you said you were, or texts you sent later to friends about this, which she had, that was helpful. Justin remembered it very similar to how Elizabeth did. Those are all really helpful details. And then later I'd find that employee A, who was not a woman in recovery, but had worked for Eric, and alleged that he had sexually assaulted her in the office in the middle of the workday. She also told me, separate from Elizabeth, that she had also received pictures like that on Snapchat from Eric. So, sometimes there's no perfect corroboration. It's like, if she had had the picture, then that's one thing. But like in these situations where you're caught in this really intense moment, you're not thinking, well, I hope I talk to a reporter one day. I should keep all the receipts. So it's my job to then think differently or creatively about how much information around that I can get as humanly possible. And then to present that to our fact checker and our lawyer, and of course our editors, to be like, is this enough? And what else do we need?
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. So, let's fast forward. It's February 2022. You actually go to Eric Spofford with your findings, right? Do the
Yeah.
responsible thing. And the response is from a lawyer. And not only is he saying that his client denies the allegations, but he's threatening to sue you if you go forward with the reporting.
Yes.
Now, again, you're like not close to doing the podcast, but as you said, like you had local reporting, you felt a responsibility, you publish a story online, you air a two-part series on the radio. That can be a hard decision,
It was.
both to put your stuff forward. Maybe talk us through a little bit about like making that decision. I think a lot of reporters want to hold everything back.
Yeah.
So about making that decision, both from the perspective of like the risk with the lawyer and Spofford, but also just sort of emotionally of like, okay, I'm putting like a great story forward and I'm not done with the story.
Yeah. So I, just for myself, like wouldn't put reporting forward that I didn't think was bulletproof. And, like, I wouldn't even let it get to our lawyer Sig, who I just like love for the rest of my life. But you know, I'm pretty serious about corroboration. And so like we got that threat and I was like, well, what is there to sue over? You know, I mean, this is all locked down extensively. I mean, I called like so many people. It was, I love to call people. So I was, you know, I was not going to leave any stone unturned. And so we, that was kind of Allison, our freelance editor's like main job in the first chapter, which was helping us whether the big decision of, do you do a local story first, or do we just try to put everything into a show at like as soon as we can? Should mention I also had a baby in the middle of this, so that kind of complicated things, but that was, it ended up being fine. So, but really what really led the conversations was that I and our colleagues didn't want to sit on these like earth-shattering allegations about a person in such a position of power. And even during this time, Eric ended up selling to a big company and making a big show of saying how much money he made off the sale and that he was getting out of town. And even then, I just felt like we can't sit on this stuff. Like, it's been sat on for years because no one was felt like they could come forward. And we also thought, because, you know, this was like a post Me Too moment, that there would be others that would feel more confident in coming forward if we showed, hey, we're serious about this. Like, look at what we've got. And the thing that really pushed us over the edge was one of the allegations, a woman that we refer to as Employee B, who didn't want to talk to us. We had multiple high-ranking employees of Granite Recovery Centers who had firsthand knowledge of conversations either with her or documentation of conversations that she had with HR saying, Eric and I had a sexual relationship that wasn't always consensual, and that's why he's retaliating against me right now. And it took a year for the HR director at the time to decide to come on the record. And she had taken really unbelievable notes of her conversation with Employee B, and even remembered and took notes of a conversation with Eric saying that he paid Employee B to stay silent about this. And so the minute she came on the record, that's when we were like, okay, we have well more than enough to go forward here. And I think for the state, for anyone in this community, this needs to get out. And, you know, maybe there'll be some reaction to it that we will include in the podcast. And little did we know that happened
Yes.
in spades.
Yeah,
So,
I mean, this was about the time when I came on board and that decision had already been made and they were working on, you know, and I started to join some of the final edits for the first round of pieces. But you know, I remember one of the other big factors being, you know, hey, maybe we'll, you know, this will shake the tree. And you know, what a big way. Because I remember, I think, Lauren, wasn't it like within a week or two that you had that conversation with Employee A who basically told us about the 13th step, which
it
ended
was
up being,
so the
or
day the
no, sorry,
story,
that was somebody else.
yes, so the day the story came out, we had an email from a woman that we call Andrea in the
Right.
story. And I mean, it was like the day of, and it was like an email being like, I had dealt with sexual harassment from Eric Spofford, you know, would be happy to talk to you. And I was taking calls from everyone, including what we would later learn, Eric had asked anybody who was a fan of his to send me emails saying, that's not the guy that I know. I had like an email from a woman who worked at the gym that he goes to being like, he seems like a nice man. Like, oh, this is not who I know. And so I'm getting flooded with that. And then this one email from this woman named Andrea had popped up that Katie's referring to. And I got on the phone with her. She told us what happened. But more importantly, she said, Lauren, you know what this is, right? This is 13th stepping. I was like, I don't know what that is. And I went back to my desk and looked it up. And as I'm Googling it, she emails me like a copy paste from something on the internet that describes 13th stepping, which is, if you haven't heard the show, this like euphemism essentially in the recovery world of, you know, it's a 12 steps of AA. The 13th step, ha ha ha, is when you're later in sobriety and you take advantage of someone who's in early recovery. And that can mean, you know, maybe you're flirting with them and they don't want that, or it can mean, unfortunately, what we saw, which is allegations of sexual assault, gross sexual harassment, because you're in a place where, you know, you're just trying to find yourself again. And so you're extremely vulnerable. And it's unfortunate that it's people who know that journey themselves very well that unfortunately will do that harm. Never had I ever heard that phrase. And I have like a lot of family in recovery. And so I think I like slacked Katie and the rest of the gang, and I was like,
Yeah. And I
I
think
think
we
we had a
literally were like,
significant
oh,
development. Yeah.
and I think I remember we literally had this conversation then, like on Slack, like, oh, is that the title of the podcast? Like, it really, like looking back on it, that was really such a
Wow.
watershed moment because it was the thing that turned this from being, a story about one guy in New Hampshire, one really pervasive pattern here to kind of being, I think, what is truly, represents some of the best investigative journalism out there that takes this issue that is so, like, you ask anybody in recovery, they know, they've heard of 13 stepping, they know what this is, but yet if you Googled it at the time, there just was no like real in-depth news coverage. And so it took this thing that's so real for one very specific community, and we were able to, you know, bring it, to much further light. And I think in many ways, the ultimate podcast that we created has become some of the most defining journalism on this particular issue, that really helps us understand why so many people are not getting well. It kind of brings all of these things together, and kind of was almost like this hidden thing that, like, we finally are able to bring to the table now in all these conversations about why the treatment industry, why people aren't getting treatment or why people aren't getting well. So, and I know we'll get to that in a moment, but it really
Yeah.
was this really watershed moment in the life of this project that just changed everything.
Well, if that's not a encouragement for people to think about, sometimes publishing, like, as you said, if it's bulletproof publishing before you're ready to publish the whole thing. Lauren, things started very quickly to get personal and dangerous. Also something that I don't think you expected. And I don't know if everybody listening is familiar, but yeah, I wonder if you could just tell us what happened next.
Yeah. So the day the story came out, I think maybe it was the night after the local story came out, sources who I should say, you hear me say employee A or Elizabeth, like those aren't their real names. And that was a big decision that they had to make, which was they wanted to allow me to use their voice, but not their name. And I had to have multiple conversations with them about what that would mean. And they were both understood. And the night after, they both got text messages from Eric Spofford's attorney that had their first and last name, went right to their personal cell phone, and they were litigation hold letters, which at the time I had no idea what those were, but now I'm very familiar. And basically it was the start of a legal threat, not just to us at the station, but to my sources, which was pretty horrifying. These women finally like come forward with something that had harmed them, and now, they're like, what the hell is this? And not only did those two women get them, but also named sources in the story got them as well. And so I started dealing with like really terrified sources of like,
Do
what
you want
is
me to play that
this?
tape now of the women? Do you want me to play the tape now of what the women, like the messages they left you?
Oh, no, I'll get to that.
Okay,
So
okay,
that's a
good.
good, no, thank you for that. Cause then I'll tip you right up to it. So, or tee you right up to it. So, I had to then like advise them, but I'm not a lawyer, I'm a reporter. And so that was a really weird chapter. And as we're navigating that, because that would then go on for weeks, but we hadn't received any additional letters or threats from Eric or his attorneys, like as the station. It was about a month after the story came out that I got a call from my parents that their house had been vandalized. The C word had been sprayed painted on the garage, and a brick had been thrown through the basement window. And as I like called my boss, Dan Barrick, our news director, to be like, this crazy shit happened at mom and dad's house, he was like, that happened at my house too. And I immediately knew like this has to be in response to the reporting. Dan and my parents were like, maybe it's just some kid. I'm like, what? Like what kid? Like, and then we learned that it also happened the same night at a house I used to live in Hanover, New Hampshire, a house I rented when my husband was at Dartmouth. And that was obviously terrible. And I've like talked extensively, and I'm happy to do so now, about the toll that took on everybody, not just, our team, but the sources. And a month after that, there was then some additional legal threats. Eric's lawyers had convinced what they thought they convinced one of my sources to say he takes it all back. and they signed an affidavit and sent it to the board of NHPR. And we get into this in the podcast, saying, you know, now that we have this source and this signed affidavit, your whole story's blown open, which like wasn't true at all. And he wasn't even really retracting anything in this statement they got him to sign. And they threw that at us to say, like, hey, now you got to take the story down. And obviously our attorney was like, well, we're not doing that. And the day after that meeting, my house, they figured out where I live. My house was vandalized with just the beginning, spray painted under my window and a brick through the front, actually like the window right above where I am. And my parents' house was hit again. And yeah, it still is, you know, a thing that has changed my life and has made life hard and in a lot of ways. And so this is something that, you know, I'm navigating as a human being and a teammate and also a reporter who has sources who are now terrified. And so I did lose some sources who said things to me like, you can't protect me from this, Lauren. And so I think the tape you're referring to, Ellen, that you could play is sources who came to me and then ended up changing their minds. And the only way I could use this information was months later going back to them and asking, can I use unidentifiable information that you gave me from text messages or voicemails and have my colleagues read it? And we played this at the start of the episode where we dig into all this chaos.
Yeah, I might not be able to, I'm gonna, here we go. This is the tape.
Hi, Lauren. This is really difficult because I've mulled over this for a year on whether or not I should even message you back out of fear, but I'm willing to chat anonymously.
Hi, Lauren. I'm happy to talk to you about some things that have happened after I left GRC.
I know I'm doing the right thing by being honest and speaking up, but then there's times where I just feel like, God, you need to put a sock in it because you're going to get yourself in trouble.
Hi, Lauren. I don't want anything in writing via email that can be used against me. I'm frankly scared of retaliation from Eric, and I'd rather have a phone call or meet with you.
I am so filled with anxiety. I'm filled with fear.
Sorry for the no contact. Can we check in tomorrow and maybe connect then? I'm just overly anxious and stressed about it all.
He has money. He has lawyers.
His power and money is intimidating to me, and I don't want to end up in a courtroom.
I'm honestly thinking that I'm no longer going to share my name.
I honestly don't want to be involved anymore.
With everything that my family is going through right now,
I just don't want to be a part of it.
I want to take my statements away about Eric.
Yes,
Wow.
you'll have to listen to episode 3 so you can get like the good music in there because Zoom is really killing some of the vibes.
Yeah, I
but-
know. Wow.
Yeah, that was like a really creative idea that like came to me. So I just was pretty devastated by a lot of things, but I have to say mainly like the vandalism, and then we were then sued by Eric Spofford for defamation, that the combination of violent and legal retaliation had the intended impact, which was that there were sources that I had done, you know, multiple interviews with or gone to their home, and they just either ghosted or told me explicitly, why would I, you know, and I get it, you know, like why would they? And I felt this weird power imbalance between me and them, that like, you know, the station's insurance policy was going to cover me for a lawsuit, but, you know, I can't be buying my source's attorney. You know, it was really, it genuinely put me in a bind. And so there were significant, you know, journalistic and First Amendment implications to what happened. And I just was so determined for the listeners to know what that was like for the women and what that was also like to be on this side of it. Not in any, we were all really determined that my stuff wasn't going to weigh any heavier than the reason why we were all here, which was that sexual misconduct and addiction treatment is, you know, sexual misconduct is terrible everywhere, but it's especially terrible here, where the dynamics are so awful, the vulnerability is so deep, the disease is so terrible, that it's just and the stigma is so great that like the obstacles ahead of people are just really insurmountable, it seems. And I didn't want, my pain to be any, bigger than any of that. And so and I'm happy to say, like, people have told us that they felt like we really struck that balance really well. And I don't say this to bash any like other like reporter's journey type stories. Like, I love those. Canary by the Washington Post from like many eons ago is like one of my favorite shows. But we just felt like there was a balance we needed to strike where people knew that I was involved and it was harmful to me and my family and my colleagues, but yet this was the real lesson here is that retaliation and coming forward with allegations of sexual misconduct is still exceedingly difficult. And unfortunately, I don't think that's going to change, but
Yeah.
yeah.
Well, audience, I want to encourage you to ask questions, but I want to follow up on that a little bit because as you said, like all of this eventually became part of the story, but it wasn't an easy decision, right? And I had read, you mentioned your fantastic editor, Allison McAdam. She wrote a really interesting piece about this quandary, right, in the Neiman reports, about that decision to make you the personal attacks part of the story. And I just want to read a small section. She said, in the face of this vandalism, we made a decision that changed the shape of our project. Lauren was now part of the story, and we decided she would be allowed to report on herself on the podcast. Early on, we had expressed fatigue with podcasts in which the host reporter is the central character and narrates their journey. They'd become a cliche and sometimes crossed ethical lines. It was essential to us that the podcast center the women who had come forward to report abuse despite fears. But now Lauren's own experience of being threatened while reporting and subsequently sued reinforced one of the goals of our project to illustrate the many reasons that women don't or can't come forward to report abuse by powerful men. And even after the Me Too movement changed the discourse around sexual misconduct. As an audio producer and editor, I've always felt as though I work in a strange limbo between traditional journalism and the craft of narrative storytelling. Most of the time, the principles of journalism and narrative support each other, but sometimes they clash. And I just wanted to get you guys to reflect a little bit about like, yeah, that difficult decision, because it was, you were so committed to like creating the space for the women and letting them tell their story. And yet you were so deeply affected. And one of the most, I thought effective parts was when you just got in the studio with your producer and just downloaded like what you were going through and how hard it was. And that could be tricky. That could be really tricky. So I wonder.
Yeah, I can actually, I'm glad you brought that up, that piece of tape up, because I like write all my scripts. I do pull my own tape, and in sketching out that episode, most of it fell pretty easily into place. I kind of knew what that we faced would be relevant, or what the, best of the, it's very, it's like your usual writing process, but it's weird because it's like about me. And when we got to the part of like the vandalism, the producer, for better or for worse, had taped a lot of that. The first time was so shocking, I didn't know what to think. The second time, I had the wherewithal to put my phone on record, and when I wasn't calling like the police or the FBI or like our team, I would roll from my phone. And I went on a walk when I got home, and I was really angry, and I was on the phone with Jason, and I wanted that to be what people heard, was this like defiant me. And Allison made the correct assessment that, like, first of all, like, the defiance is not like the full experience, and it makes it seem, and it's not, that it's like me versus Eric, and it never has and never will be. Like, it's just a story. And at the time, and we didn't know who had conducted the vandalism. And so for me to be angry at who knows who is like, all of it was just too confusing. And at that point, I was like, you know what, I can't listen anymore of this tape of myself. Like, I'm not going to be able to be objective. And so Allison listened, and she sent back the piece that you hear in the show with the comment that, like, it's entirely up to you if we use this or not. No one on the team, and I'm sure Katie would say this now, like, no one was going to be like, well, but actually, Lauren, you're crying, and it's really compelling. Can we use the crying of you? Like, no one was going to do that. And yet what Allison said was, not only am I like reflective, but I'm telling a story that has a beginning, middle, and end that can hang together in a way that me just like yelling in the streets of Melrose, Massachusetts was like not really going to, that wasn't really going to work as effectively. And I really had to sit with that for a while because it is really intense, and I forget sometimes how intense it is. And I like played it. I get taken around to the country to all these like weird conferences now, like the ABA conference. And so I played that cut for like a room of like a couple hundred lawyers. And I was like, what am I doing? I'm like sitting here listening to myself crying for these people I don't know. So like, there's still part of me that's like, wow, that was quite a move, Lauren. But it was so real and authentic to the fear of the moment that everybody from sources to us were experiencing, that I don't regret it in the slightest. And um, there were also sections of that I wrote that everyone said, we'll give you edits, but you can take or leave some of them.
Yeah. Um, Bill Marimo asks a question which I think is something we all want to know, which is like, you know, and in follow-up episodes, you have reported about, indictments against people men connected with the vandalism, to have pled guilty. But maybe tell us a little bit about where things are now, like what's happened to Eric Spofford, what's happened in your different cases, because they were fairly intense, and there were quite a few of them.
Yeah, I mean, this was all intense. I will say the lawsuit was like pretty emotionally exhausting. We ended up winning, I should say. But it was a long haul. And yes, the defamation suit, to your question, Bill, did include sources. That's no fun at all. But I will say that it wasn't the women who were making accusations. It was 3 named former employees of Eric's, who the former HR director, the former COO, and the former director of spiritual life, who was a guy that was really close with Eric, and they wrote a book together about this company. And so this was not, not nothing. Then they ended up taking Piers out. Oh no, Piers wasn't named. I'm sorry, Piers wasn't named, but then was,
Right.
Had been involved in this retraction.
Right.
This is a whole separate thing. The 3 sources were the person who corroborated Elizabeth, and then these 2 employees of Granite Recovery Centers. That sucked, point blank. Some pro bono attorneys ended up stepping up to help those 3 out separate from us, which was like, thank God, because I mean, I can't help them with that, right? So, but then I couldn't talk to them because we're all like co-defendants in this suit. Yes, we ended up winning. There was a chapter, I mean, we just don't even have enough time to dig into all of it, but there was a chapter where even though the judge threw the thing out, Eric came back with, well, how can you throw it out if I haven't seen Lauren's reporting materials? And, we should go through a really extensive period where she has to show us. So how will I know if there's a defamation case if I don't see what she's got? And the judge came back with, well, how about I take a look at the reporting materials? And that was a really difficult chapter where the judge did end up viewing my stuff, which was all names and identifying information was all redacted. Our lawyers went through everything, but like we had to give up our cell phones and our passwords to Facebook Messenger because sources will write me there. I mean, that was just like, that's not how it's supposed to go, but in the end, it ended up being the thing that the judge was like, basically like, are you kidding? There's nothing here but diligent reporting. And issued like a fire response, which will forever be on the public record that I did a good job. So respect. But at the same time, that was rough. So at the same time that's happening, the FBI, so long story short, I live in Massachusetts. I grew up in New Hampshire, and my parents are in New Hampshire. So is Dan, our news director, and my old house. And the New Hampshire Attorney General didn't really act during the first round. And then when it happened at my house, Massachusetts was like on it. And suddenly it's this like major investigation. The FBI is involved. And lo and behold, I'm fast forwarding a lot of time. But the feds ended up charging the best friend of Eric Spofford, whose name is Eric Labarge. And they alleged that he paid 3 other individuals to do this to us. And the evidence they got was insane. They found the receipts from the Home Depot where these dudes bought the bricks. They found ATM footage where I mean, it was just like, it's been unbelievable. And so where we're at now, this is like the way Sparkno's version, but where we're at now is that all 4 of them have pled, and there are 2 left to be sentenced. And the big deal thing is that Eric Labarge, this best friend of Eric Spofford's, is set to be sentenced pretty soon. And so I'll go to that, and we'll likely have some reporting on it, but TBD as ever.
Yeah, yeah. Someone asked what the response from the police was in the first place. Were they, it sounds like from the legal system in Massachusetts might have been more responsive than in New Hampshire, but how were the police after the attacks? Did they pursue investigations or?
Yeah, well, this was wild because the Hampstead police, so that's where I grew up, where my parents lived, they were like, well, does Eric Spofford have any known associates? And I remember being like, okay, well, I only know about all this because of my reporting. So am I like in a moment where I mean, I had like 10 seconds to think about all these really big things, like, am I sharing reporting with the police now? Like, I can't, that's not how this works. And so I had to like scan my brain for like, okay, well, what information do I have that's on the record? And I just said what everyone knows, which is Eric Labarge. And that is now, lo and behold, who's going to be sentenced. But, it was a really weird, like, they wanted answers about what I knew about, everyone that could be involved. And I was like, well, I got to think about that. And, I never would share any off the record or even on background information with anyone, never mind the police. But at the same time, it was a really weird thing because, of course, I wanted to be safe, but I would never say anything that would jeopardize my reporting or that wasn't something that a source had allowed me to say in public. And so that ended up being, what guided me. But yeah, the police, I will say the local police were like, in Hampstead at least is what I can speak to, like they were like on it and at my parents' house, and helped with the FBI, I think, once they started making arrests, when it was normal or in whatever jurisdiction. But yeah, it was a time. Katie literally, can we just, again, Katie had just started working with us. Like, it's not like, that's not normal. Like,
Yeah, I mean, I will never forget that first phone call when you called me and told me about what happened to your parents. I mean, you were frantic, and then all of a sudden you're like, oh, wait a minute, I gotta go. Dan just said that, like, Dan's just calling me back. And then, I mean, this was definitely one of those situations. I think the thing that we all had to kind of come to terms with is, like, for each of us in our own way, this was a situation for which we really had no roadmap. Like, once the vandalism happened, like the defamation lawsuit, in some ways it felt like, I mean, maybe Lauren, you have a different perception of this. It seemed like the team was much more prepared for something like that happening because of the robust legal review we were already doing on the original story, to try to make it as tight as possible to prevent there being a lawsuit. But in some ways that was much more expected than the vandalism. I think that really just sent shockwaves, and definitely, like, those shockwaves didn't just stick with us. It shocked, our board. It shocked our, company president, who suddenly it trickled out, like, all these decisions that had to be made. One of the awkward roles that Allison and I ended up playing as people who, like, we hadn't personally experienced the vandalism. Like, in some ways, I think there's a version in which Spofford and his attorneys still don't even really know that we exist in this orbit. But, like, how do we, support the team? And also, how do we grapple with, suddenly this became a news story, kind of going back to some of the earlier questions about how we made these decisions. Lauren did not choose to be part of this story. By suing us, Eric chose that. And by, organizing this vandalism, Eric Labarge chose that. And so, in some ways, it's sort of like we had to kind of keep reminding ourselves we are just trying to wade through this reality that was forced upon us, and how do we figure out, just like the next right thing to do to both support each other so we can tell this story, but also, like, how do we navigate, getting this out in kind of the larger world, because of course this became a news story. Lauren had like news trucks parked in front of her house. And we were dealing with requests for comment from other journalists. So it's like, how do we, sort of have this posture of like, we want to cooperate with other news outlets, but we also have to keep ourselves and our team safe. And also we have this story that now we are really committed to telling as a chapter of this whole phenomenon that we're reporting about. So those things were all, just extremely, extremely tricky. Fortunately, along the way, we did find some really incredible resources that do exist. Like when you feel like you have no roadmap, there actually are some organizations out there that deal with
We're
this.
making it now. We're like,
Right, we're kind of making it now. We're also offering ourselves up to people as a resource for
Yeah.
folks who find themselves either being retaliated against or feel like they could be. They're actually. It's comforting now in hindsight to know, okay, there are some things that you can do and some people you can turn to. But at the time, it really was a really, all of us experienced it in a different way, but it was incredibly excruciating.
Yeah, yeah. I'll just remind the audience, like, they have some of these tips. We'll be publishing a tip sheet. You'll get it. I think, I think this kind of threats against journalists, we've obviously seen it, go online, et cetera. It doesn't always come to your home in this way. But yeah, having the resources to know how to protect yourself is so important. Just one more question from Victoria Sneed, and I really like this for both of you, which is why did you choose journalism and why radio or why audio? And then do you think that the Press Act would do anything to protect you and your sources? I don't actually know. I'm not sure I know what the Press Act is. And would anti-SLAPP lawsuits in New Hampshire help more? And then lastly, do you have any internships? But I'll let you take that offline.
That's so funny. Katie, do you want to go first about how you chose journalism?
Sure, thanks. So yeah, the really short version is I was in college and really unsure what I wanted to do with my life. And right at that moment, I happened to start listening to the This American Life podcast. This was back in the days when have to download it from iTunes and wait every week for the new episode. There wasn't as big of a older archive available then. And it just really, I always known that I'd wanted to be some kind of writer. But listening to this, it just struck me. It just brought so many like random skills and interests that I had together. And I just kept thinking like, God, how do you do this? I want to make this. And it took me a really long route to eventually get here. But really for me, it was always that combination of like journalism plus long form audio documentary kind of work. Obviously I had a very long career in like more daily news, but I think that helped me get to this place where I'm now ready to be shepherding these kinds of projects, because to me there's something about being able to spend time with a story in this way and tell the fullest story that you possibly can, and spend time with people beyond these little sound bites. And also hearing people is so different than, say getting a quote for print. I mean, I think, this is not to like knock our print colleagues. I think there's some incredible narrative print journalism that is also very immersive. But for me, there's just something about being told a story that just goes back to when I was a little kid. That just it reaches something very deep inside me, and you can really you hear the nuances and not just like what the person is saying, but how they're saying it. The environment that they're saying it in, the sounds that are going on behind them, the interaction. I often love, especially in Lauren's work, like for me, like a hallmark of her work is that like Q&A, like her questions and then the person's response, or her response to what somebody is saying. And so yeah, being able to make things like that is why I got into journalism, and now I finally have my dream job, helping Jason make such things. And yes, we do have internships at NHPR. We also have an incredible fellowship called the Couch Fellowship. That is worth looking into. Our team has had an intern before. We don't always, just because of the nature of our work, like we want to make sure that the internship is satisfying for that person. And so when they're here in the summertime, we're not always at the point in the life of these projects where it would make sense to have somebody. But we're definitely always open to that. But there are great internships in both the NHPR podcast unit and the newsroom that are definitely worth looking into, and they're paid. And they help with housing, which is really nice. So yeah, Lauren, to you.
Well, I'll just say, like Katie, I was really compelled by the intimacy of audio. That was something that really captured me from when I like found it very late in life. It was like not till college that I even knew NPR existed. But to your question about the anti-SLAPP stuff, just to like, because Katie and I both had very like similar interests in why we wanted to join this lovely field. And I think it's like the best job there is. I mean, let's be clear. Even though I've dealt with all this bullshit, I still love what we do. I, you know, I think that I'm not a lawyer, but I do understand that there are protections that we do not have in the state of New Hampshire for journalists that would have been helpful in like getting a lawsuit like this dealt with a lot quicker. So that's like kind of like a loose answer, I think, to your question. That yeah, we just didn't have, I mean, there wasn't any like, I wish Sig was here. Our lawyer was wonderful and would have a great answer for this. But I think the answer is like probably, but it's like hard to truly know, of course. Depends on the judge. It depends on like what was in the lawsuit. And this was like a pretty substantial complaint that they filed. Even though there wasn't anything with of merit in it, it was still pretty weighty and long and a wild situation. But I guess I would just end by that question by saying why I still choose journalism, even though I think we all know that we're in an environment where like not everyone believes in what we do, or there's confusion about how we do it or what is fake or not. Those are the things that continue to motivate me. I think a lot of the experience of reporting this, not just like the tough stuff, but even in the beginning conversations, it was a lot of like telling people what audio journalism is. And I used to cover politics for many years, and you didn't have to have those conversations. It was a game that we all played and everyone knew the rules. And, with this, I found like, and with a lot of my reporting now, every conversation wasn't just like, hi, can you? It was like, hello, I am Lauren. This is what I make. It might be this, it might be that. And every conversation was like that. And I think as much extra work as that is for us, I think it's an essential piece of like bridging whatever, I don't even think divide is the right word, but whatever like misinformation exists about what we do and how we do it, and then what happens when it gets out somewhere. I find that like I had to have more conversations with sources because of the lawsuit, but I was already doing that where I was reminding like Elizabeth, I like went to her house, had to look in her eye and say, hey, this is going to be a local news story. It may then also be a podcast. Your voice will be in it, not your name. That means people who know your voice, they're going to know who you are. Like, is this cool with you? Because, honestly, I don't think people really know. And I don't say this to begrudge or like judge them. Like, there's so many sources of information out there now and not all of it good. And so it's naive of us to expect that people get what we all make. And so I'm just going to continue to do things
and how
like
long
that.
it takes.
Yeah, not only because I love it, but because I think it's only good for our society that we continue to explain to people what we do.
Yeah.
Well, there are more questions, but I'm going to try and wrap up a little bit. This was great. I couldn't agree with you more. I think not assuming people understand what we do, and more importantly, how people like New Hampshire Public Radio works, that it's not like other news sources that they might be, and why to trust you. Lauren and Katie, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us. And really thanks to the FIJ for helping support our work. It really was critical. Episode 5 would not happen probably without you guys, or at least not in the same way. So really, thank you so much.
Well, on behalf of FIJ, you're welcome. We're thrilled to be able to support this kind of work. And in fact, again, there'll be a tip sheet. A recording of this will be available both on our website, and also you'll be getting an email. Just a couple of important reminders. The deadline for submitting proposals for regular grants, this is up to $10,000, is January 27th, 2025. So you still have some time. The deadline for seed grants, this is a relatively new grant that we're giving, and these are grants for that preliminary reporting that you have to do to figure out if you've got a story, right? Those are up to $2,500, and the deadline is January 31st, 2025. If you have questions about applying, if you want to make any suggestions for a webinar, you can email us at grants@fij.org. And if you go to the FIJ website, there's an FAQ, there's a video to help you with the application process in case, you've never done this before. Just a personal thanks to Eric Ferreira, the Executive Director of FIJ, and the entire board that's supported this webinar series. We are planning on being back next year. So for those of you who have joined us today, thank you. Have a wonderful holiday. Lauren and Katie and your whole team, thank you again for the work, the courage, modeling the way, and for helping all of us, be reminded about how important this work is. Have a great
Thank you
weekend,
so
everybody.
much.
Take good care.